Good evening, everyone, and welcome to our KO Cambridge seminar. And it's my great pleasure to welcome you here to Darwin College. My name is John Nielsen-Wright. For those of you who don't know me, I teach at the Faculty of Asian and Middle Eastern Studies. And I want to begin by first thanking KO University and our colleagues who've come all the way from Japan, Hosoya Yuichi and Tsuruoka Michito, who are joining us for this panel. I also want to thank the sponsor of this event, Nihon Cyber Defense, and Dougie Grant, who's here representing the company. Also, importantly, as you can see from this very striking banner at the middle of the panel, I want to thank the Faculty of Asian and Middle Eastern Studies and my colleague, Professor Adolfsson, who's sitting at the back, who has been a champion of all things Japanese across the university. And last but not least, I want to thank the Centre for Geopolitics and Professor Brendan Sims and Professor Bill Hurst, who have been the co-originators of this event today. I'm very grateful that we are able to collaborate between our two institutions in Cambridge. And in a way, this event is an opportunity to highlight our commitment to doing more work across the university, but particularly in the centre. We've set up a new program on the geopolitics of Japan and Korea, which I'm fortunate to be leading, and we see this event as an opportunity to introduce to you and the wider community our work in this area. But on to the substance of our discussion today. It is a particularly timely moment, I think, to be thinking about the UK-Japan security relationship. You'll all know that in May, at the G7 summit in Tokyo, in Hiroshima rather, with Japan in the chair as the head of the G7, the two governments, our two leaders, our Prime Minister Sunak and Prime Minister Kishida, announced the important Hiroshima Accord. And I think it's striking to look at the language of the Accord and what it represents in terms of the bilateral relationship. The Accord mentions that, quote, our partnership stands at a turning point in history. That's perhaps quite ambitious language, but I think it reflects the commitment on the part of the two governments and the two leaders to underscore the importance of bilateral ties. In Prime Minister Kishida, we have a Prime Minister who has a great deal of experience in foreign affairs, having served for no less than 8 years as the Foreign Minister under the former leadership of Prime Minister Abe, the late Prime Minister, the longest serving Foreign Minister in Japan, Prime Minister Kishida. And of course, in Britain, we have, under Prime Minister Sunak's government, an extension of that idea of Britain committed to playing a global role. We've seen Britain recently join the CPTPP, the important trade initiative in the region. And on so many issues, the Hiroshima Accord signals and underscores the commitment of the two countries to a whole host of different priority interests. Freedom in general, democracy, the rule of law, human rights, and open and fair trade. And the Accord also signals the two governments' commitment to an enhanced global strategic partnership around three signature areas. One, the idea of breaking down regional division between the Indo Pacific and the Euro-Atlantic region. Two, deepening economic partnership and cooperation. I've mentioned CPTPP, but in a whole host of other areas, the promotion of cooperation in the STEM disciplines, AI and quantum, and of course developing work in the production of semiconductors. And the third area, broad issues of security more broadly defined, the Sustainable Development Goals, energy security, and dealing with the challenge of climate change. All of this also comes on the back of another important announcement in January of this year, the Reciprocal Access Agreement, which was hailed by the two governments as the most significant defence agreement between the two countries in more than a century. So that gives you a clear sense, I think, of the ambition that is behind the two governments working together. But it comes at a time when the world, of course, is facing a whole host of critical challenges, whether it's the war in Ukraine, insecurity in the South China Seas, the perennial challenge of a nuclear North Korea, and then most recently and dramatically and tragically, the situation in the Middle East. And if that weren't enough, of course, the broader debate about the resilience of democracy, the rise of rival authoritarian regimes, challenges from without, but also challenges from within our own liberal democratic states, as well as some of those existential challenges that I mentioned to do with climate change and energy, as well as pandemics and the challenge of global migration. So there are all sorts of powerful reasons why our two countries should be working closely together. And those are some of the issues that we're going to want to explore as part of this panel discussion. Before we get to the panel, I just want to hand over to Brendan Sims to say a few words about the Centre for Geopolitics.
Thank you very much, John, and I would like to reiterate all those words of thanks. As you've heard, my name is Brendan Sims. I'm the co-director of the Centre with my colleague Bill Hurst, who's in charge, as it were, of the East Asian half of the globe. I do more Europe. And I just wanted to say how pleased we are that Japan is receiving more attention from the geopolitical point of view. At the Centre, we're devoted to the study of the geopolitical past, present, and future. And as John says, we very much hope that within the framework of the broader Indo Pacific program, which you can see on the banner over there, we will have a burgeoning Japan-focused geopolitical program. And this is very much the first step in that direction. But I think I've said enough already, and I hand back to John.
Thanks very much. So our plan today, rather than have a set presentations, is to encourage a discussion. So before we get on to the discussion, let me very briefly introduce the panelists. From the left to the right, Professor Anthony Best from the LSE, a well-known historian of the UK-Japan relationship. Next to him, Ambassador Paul Madden, who until recently was our ambassador in Tokyo. Professor Chris Hughes from Warwick University, a specialist in Japanese security policy. Next to him, Professor Guibourg Delamotte, all the way from France, just off the Eurostar. And then next to her, Professor Hosoe Yuichi of Keio University. And last but not least, Professor Tsuruoka Michito. So, without further ado, let me kick off by taking us back to the past and ask Anthony to perhaps reflect a little bit on the nature of the bilateral relationship, what has sustained it for so long, but also to remind us perhaps that it hasn't always been a harmonious relationship.
Just a bit.
And I'm going to pass this microphone all the way to you, because we only have one, but if you can share, I'd appreciate that. Okay. Thanks.
Yes, well, I've written quite extensively on the history of Anglo-Japanese relations up until about 1960 so far. And in the last book I did, I was trying to understand how the alliance came about in an age when racial science was so dominant. It seemed to me an interesting question to pose. And I think you can see the relationship developing in a number of ways. Japan seeking a European partner, especially after the triple intervention of 1895, feeling that it was isolated against European powers. I think for Britain, which is more my specialism, I mapped out what I thought were 4 stages of the relationship. One, interest, 1860s, early 1870s. One of admiration from the 1870s into the 1880s up until the end of the unequal treaties. A short period of respect, and then trust. Alliance can only come through trust. And it was the sense that Japan had its own civilization, that it was adapting to Western civilization, that meant that this relationship could come into being, and that those who were skeptical about the alliance in Britain could be brought round to accept an alliance that went over the racial, cultural, and religious boundaries. And I think that's an important thing. And then that relationship was sustained and indeed nurtured very carefully by the governments in the two countries and the two royal courts in showing signs of admiration and respect to each other. And of course, clearly what this all sealed, all of this, was a shared geopolitical understanding of the world. But that in itself, I don't think would have led to an alliance. It needed more than that. It needed some cultural element to bring them closer together. The alliance, of course, ends in 1922, and then things begin to sour. 1920s, Japan's still a status quo power. It votes with us on various reparations conferences, and we're very happy about that. It's quite a loyal status quo country, and then along comes the Depression. The Depression is the beginning of the disturbed relationship. We often focus entirely on the Pacific War. Today I was looking in the university archive at the papers of Sir Thomas Barlow, who was involved in the cotton business. He doesn't really have a very good view of Japan in 1934. In fact, the language is little short of yellow peril wording. And what I would say as I hand on to Yuichi to go into the post-45 period is we should never forget how long it took for this relationship to become normal. In the period of the Wilson government, there were attempts to persuade Harold Wilson to visit Japan, to meet Japanese ministers, and the reluctance was really noticeable. Japan simply wasn't. There were no votes to be won by meeting Japanese ministers. In fact, there were votes to be lost. The politicians again and again say to those in the Foreign Office, well, we understand what you're saying, but we're not doing it because we don't think we can sell this policy to the British people. When do relations become normal? When do they become warm? It begins in the Heath period, but once Heath leaves office, it seems to be back to normal with Labour. It's only the Thatcher period, as I can see, where that relationship really begins to make progress. And even then, in the background, there is still a need for careful management. When the Emperor Hirohito died in the late 80s, the Prince of Edinburgh went to represent the Queen. He had to go to the Commonwealth War Cemetery in Yokohama, had to, because otherwise this would have gone all over the press. So there is very careful management. We even have some material from the Blair administration now released at the National Archives. And even in 1998, you can see the management of this relationship quite carefully done. So don't be over-sentimental about this relationship. It's had its troubles in the past. Lastly, I'd just like to say, not as a historian, but as a British subject, I'm fascinated to hear what my colleagues are going to say, because as a British subject, I really wonder about this close relationship in defence, when surely our priorities in Britain have been clearly set out to us in recent years. Russia has not gone away. Surely our defence ought to be the North Atlantic and not the Royal Navy sailing around the South China Seas. There are plenty of people capable of doing that. I don't think we need to join in. The intelligence is another matter, but I am rather sceptical because it's my taxes.
Anthony, thank you very much for starting on a provocative note to get us to think about beyond the rhetoric. Yuichi, you're a long-standing watcher of the US-Japan relationship, and what Anthony was saying about trust is, of course, very important in the context of relations between Washington and Tokyo, particularly when you think about the bitterness and the legacy of the Pacific War, the impact of that. And yet here we have an alliance relationship that has lasted a long time and is perhaps as strong as it's ever been. When you contrast that relationship with the UK-Japan relationship and think about perhaps the later period of the Cold War, particularly reflecting on the impact of what happened during the Thatcher and Nakasone years, what are the things that stand out for you?
Well, thank you very much, John, for a very good question. I like this question. And before answering to this question, let me thank you and Brendan for organizing this event. It's really nice to have an event on Japan here in Cambridge. I spent 1 year as a visiting fellow at Downing College until last year. I had a wonderful time, and it's really nice to come back here, of course. But well, during my year as a visiting fellow there, I couldn't have a real Japan event of this sort. I mean, focusing on Japan and Indo Pacific. I think that Japan is becoming more important than before in international arena. So it's really nice to examine whether and how Japan plays important role in the current international relations. But at Keio University, I'm teaching European international history of the last 400 years. And so I'm basically, I think I assume myself as a historian, but at the same time, I am doing some policy research at several think tanks, and particularly this year, we established a new think tank at Keio University, Keio Center for Strategy, together with Professor Tsuruoka, and our model is exactly Center for Geopolitics. And well, I think the center has been extremely successful in organizing many events. Last year, yes. When I was there at Cambridge, I joined in us. I watched several important events relating to the war in Ukraine, which you organized, Brendan. And I learned so many things. It's really nice to have those kind of events, which is extremely relevant to everybody who live today. And coming back to John's question, so that's why the reason why I said that I like this question is I'm always trying to bridge historical issues and current contemporary international relations issues. So this question relates to that. First of all, I like to regard the history of UK-Japan relations as a difficult relationship. It's difficult because of several reasons. Number one, because of the gap of understanding. Japan has been frequently saying that we are natural allies, and we have had a good tradition of alliance since 1902. But as Anthony mentioned, there has been so many difficulties. There have been so many hurdles and barriers between the two countries. But sometimes the Japanese people, direct member, politicians, journalists, do not fully understand those difficulties. That's why sometimes Japanese people face some of the shocking events in the UK, which show the difficulty between the two countries. So I agree with what Anthony perhaps tried to indicate in his words regarding to that. But having said that, I also like to add that in the last several decades, some important leading political figures in both sides, in UK and in Japan, have been trying very hard to overcome these difficulties. Number one, Nakasone. Number two, Margaret Thatcher. And also Tony Blair played a very important role. And Shinzo Abe and Junichiro Koizumi might be another one. I like to say why this is the case. Number one, until 1980s or 1990s, former POW issues have been always difficult issue to solve between the two countries. So when I look at some of the materials, historical documents, I was so shocked that in 1990s, perhaps historical issues, not maybe until the beginning of the 1990s, historical issues were more difficult between Japan and the UK than between Japan and China or between Japan and Korea. So after the beginning of the 1990s, Japan's historical relationship with China and Korea became more difficult because until 1980s, as you know, Korea didn't have a democracy. That's why most of the public opinion had to be oppressed. They couldn't say what they want to say on historical issues. But of course, UK is a democratic country, so people can freely say what they want to say. So in a sense, historical issues were difficult. But due to several reasons, like Nakasone and Thatcher, I have done several archival works. Margaret Thatcher would be the first post-war British Prime Minister who fully understood the real importance of the UK-Japan relations. having visited Japan, she visited several factories like Nissan factory, and she also visited Tsukuba city, where she could see so many the cutting-edge technology factories, laboratories. She understood the importance of Japan from the point of view of British national interest. To be closer to Japan would be national interest to the UK, to revitalize the economy, to revitalize its industry. That's why she decided to invite, actually there was a interministerial steering committee in the UK in the early 1980s, where the British government examined the importance of Japan. The answer was yes, Japan is important. The UK should create a closer relationship with Japan, due largely to British own national interest, and they did. They did to be closer to Japan. So that's why I think that Britain decided a very important thing under the Margaret Thatcher administration. And also the middle 1990s, like Ambassador Hiroaki Fuji, I myself and Mizuki edited a diplomatic memoir of Ambassador Hiroaki Fuji. And he contributed hugely to try to clear the misunderstanding regarding to historical issues, of course, PLW issues. Due to largely to these efforts, I think until the middle of 1990s, the two sides overcome many difficult issues. That's why after that, two countries can become closer. So this is the current situation.
And that's a very useful segue, reminding us that ambassadors matter. For me to ask Paul a question about his perspective on the UK-Japan relationship, because as Yuichi was pointing out, this decade of the 1980s was hugely important. Margaret Thatcher set up, I understand at that stage, the UK-Japan 21st Century Group, a body that brings together people who are intimately involved with Japan, brings together the political communities. But of course, the relationship is much more than just politicians and bureaucrats, and even allowing for the importance of ambassadors. At the basic level of civil society, business, there are very important ties that have developed, perhaps in some cases organically. Paul, can you reflect on that set of relationships, but also maybe tell us a little bit about how, looking at the relationship today, you see the importance of Japan in Britain's overall foreign policy?
Sure, thank you. Well, I recognise the description of the history up to the 80s that Anthony and Yuichi described. I would just say one thing on Commonwealth war graves, which is there's a long tradition of, I can remember taking ministers and members of the royal family to Commonwealth war graves in many countries, both ones who were on our side in that conflict and ones who weren't. So yes, I think since the 1980s, we've seen a real strengthening of the relationship. But I think it's been very heavily focused until more recently on the economic pillar, and particularly on the back of the huge wave of Japanese inward investment, which started coming in after the Thatcher encouragement, to the extent that even today around 40% of Japan's investment in Europe is in the UK. You talked about some of the different groups who would be involved in this. I think previously, very few members of parliament have known much about Japan. I think our current Chancellor of the Exchequer, Jeremy Hunt, is an honourable exception. He lived in Japan in his 20s and speaks reasonable Japanese and takes a close interest. And there are a few other honourable exceptions. But for the most part, I think not many British members of parliament would know Japanese members of parliament, not enough personal relationships. Some of that is around the language. But I think also on the Japanese side, it's been because there has been such an overwhelming focus on the US from the Japanese side, which kind of crowds everyone else out. On civil society, again, there are good academic links, there are good friendship organisations like the Japan-British Society, but I find that it's a relatively familiar pool of faces on each side, which may be deep but not very wide. Although I would say that the Japanese government's JET program, which takes young people to teach in Japan, has created a big pool of people in the UK, now running up to people in their 40s, I guess, who know Japan quite well. Diplomats, some of these British Foreign Office has a long tradition of training people in Japanese and sending them back regularly. I think they represent a respected source of Japan knowledge in Japan, and I think they probably provide the main source of Japan expertise in the UK system. Similarly, the Gaimusho, the Japanese Foreign Ministry, has people who know the UK well. But I think I would say that in the Japanese system, it's generally less well joined up across the administration than the UK system. I say that a bit cautiously, because if you watch the news over the last 2 or 3 years, you might wonder how well joined up we are in this country. But as a general point, so for example, it would be very important to talk to a ministry like METI alongside talking to the Gaimusho. I think, coming up to date, I think Japan has become much more important to the UK beyond the economic sphere and across into political and security spheres in very recent years. And I think there are a number of reasons for that. I think the first is a growing disenchantment with China. We've moved from a golden era in the relationship to describing China as a systemic competitor now. I think the second thing is that post-Brexit, the UK has been looking to engage more with Asia Pacific, or the Indo Pacific as we now describe it, looking for new challenges, looking to take on those new challenges and find new partners. Thirdly, I think the end of more or less 2 decades of war fighting in Afghanistan and Iraq has freed up the British military to have the capacity to be able to send the new aircraft carriers out to the region, which they wouldn't have been able to do when Afghanistan was going on. And on the Japanese side, I think all of this is reciprocated because Japan has been very keen to internationalize the China problem, as it would see it. And secondly, to bring in more allies, not just the US, and they see concerns that the US may be becoming more isolationist.
Great, thank you. I wonder if we can come back to the point that Anthony threw into the mix, which is the question of Russia. And if I can ask Michito to reflect on the role that Russia has played in the UK-Japan relationship, because there have been moments when it has felt as if the two countries share a very different view of Russia. I'm thinking back to 2018, the Novichok poisoning case. Certainly to those of us who are looking at this from the outside, it seemed that Japan's preoccupation with the question of the post-war territorial settlement meant that when it came to the question of the strategic challenge of Russia, at least in those years, there was a tendency perhaps on the part of the political establishment and maybe the civil service to be relatively less assertive in singling out Russia for criticism, and alongside the concerns of the British, certainly. Has that, first of all, do you think that was true? And how have things changed as a result of the situation in Ukraine?
Okay, thank you very much. And first, thank you very much for the invitation. And I'm very pleased to be here this evening. The Russia has often been sort of a source of tensions between Japan and UK, and Japan and UK have been having some different perceptions on Russia, and that's quite true. And but important thing that I wanted to emphasize is that the Japan-Russia relationship has never been quite good. So for historical reasons and of course for territorial disputes. In that context, Prime Minister Abe's approach to Russia, sort of an overture to Russia, was a sort of aberration rather than a normal situation, the state in Japan's foreign policy. But and particularly after in the wake of the illegal annexation of Crimea back in 2014, Japan's sanctions on Russia were not really strong. So Japan sort of followed to some extent G7, but the level of the severity of sanctions was really low. And that was mainly because that Abe was really determined to improve relations with Russia, and first and foremost to conclude the peace treaty with Russia. But at the same time, the strategic thinking was that for Japan, the addressing Russia and China simultaneously is a sort of strategic nightmare. So and that was also the part of the reasons why Abe was really committed to improving relations with Russia. But this time, in the wake of Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine, started in February last year. There are, I think, 3 factors why this time it's different. And as a result of that, now Japan's position is much more aligned with that of the UK or other G7 partners, including the United States. And first difference has to do with the fact that this time the scale of Russia's action is very different. So scale of destruction and the number of casualties on the Ukrainian side, it's very different. So it's just impossible for Japan to have a more relaxed approach to Russia because it's really serious. The situation is much more serious. And secondly, because of a rise of China and because of various sorts of tensions over Taiwan, there is now a more acute awareness about the interconnectedness and the linkages between the European theater and the Indo Pacific theater. So that's why that Prime Minister Kishida has been emphasizing that today's Ukraine could be the East Asia tomorrow. So and thirdly, the personal factor also matters. So it's just obvious that Kishida is not Abe. So during the Abe period, the Prime Minister Abe's commitment to improve relations with Russia was very much based on his personal commitment. But Kishida is very different. Of course, Kishida served foreign minister for I think it's more than 4 years, under Prime Minister Abe. But his personal commitment to the idea of improving relations with Russia was much lower than Prime Minister Abe. So the Kishida, Abe, very different. So because of these 3 factors, this time it's very different, and we see more strategic alignment between Japan and the UK. Thank you.
Thank you for that. So Kishida and Abe very different on the Russia issue, but arguably very similar when it comes to thinking about this kind of breakthrough in security policy that we've seen over a number of years. Chris, you've written a lot about Abe's security policy. Japan is now being talked about as a so-called tier 1 power, a country that has a great deal of influence, not just regionally, but globally. How much of that do you think is sustainable? Does it reflect a change in the strategic outlook of Japan's security and defense policymakers? And to what extent do you think Britain and Japan are on the same page when they think in terms of global security?
Yeah, thank you for the question, John, and thanks for the invitation today. So I think the question you ask is a really important one. Obviously, that's the kind of question a lot of people have been asking because, as I'm sure many colleagues here today will have picked up, last year Japan announced its new national defence strategy, revised national security strategy, very kind of fundamental strengthening of defence capabilities. So obviously there's a question about how sustainable that is, how longer term shift this is. I would tend to think that this is the culmination, although it will continue, of a long term shift, and it will continue. So Japan won't backslide, principally because of the kinds of variables that many colleagues here have already touched upon. So if you're kind of more of a realist inclination, you tend to see the international structure as very important in terms of driving Japan's strategic orientation. As we've already heard, for a long time, North Korea has been a sort of persistent irritant to Japanese security into the US-Japan alliance, and has got Japan wondering about its strategy and capabilities. Of course, China has always been a constant worry, but it's become more and more manifest and more actual and more direct. And then, of course, as Tsuruoka Sensei said, Russia's invasion of Ukraine has really sort of galvanized, I think, the sense that the international structure really is moving against Japan in a very, very serious way. So Japan has to do more. In terms of the domestic situation, again, as we know, Japanese public has been quite reluctant in terms of seeing the Japanese state do more in security and thinking about the potential use of force as an element of statecraft. But I think we have seen a gradual shift in that position. Part of that's to do with something that's been very sort of acquiescing, sort of reluctant realism, it's called, led by many Japanese policymakers. Some of it has been much more sort of actively trying to promote that agenda, Prime Minister Abe. But again, I think we saw a very interesting shift in 2022, perhaps a sea change where the Japanese public seemed to be willing to go along with this much more sort of fundamental shift in Japanese security policy. Is Japan a global power? You may be referring to a book I wrote in 2022 where I talked about Japan as a global military power. Slightly provocative title, but really what I was trying to point out was that, Japan, we must think of Japan as now its security responsibilities beginning to stretch outside the Japanese archipelago and its own immediate surroundings, beyond Northeast Asia, beyond East Asia, beyond the Indo Pacific, and of course, as we've heard, it's beginning to stretch out and cooperate with a variety of partners in the Indo Pacific, Australia, of course, India, and beyond NATO, and of course the UK. I think your question, John, is how complementary or how much mileage has the UK got? That UK-Japan relationship got? I think Tony raised a very interesting question about just how compatible are UK-Japan interests long term. I think we are seeing very strong strategic alignment, as Tsuruoka Sensei said. There are many things that Japan and UK can do in security, and as Paul said, I think principally from the Japanese point of view, the ability of the UK to show presence in the Indo-Pacific, to complicate China's agenda, to show that Japan is not alone, that Japan has friends, has shared values, is very, very important. And there's some very, very important things that the UK and Japan can do in defence industrial cooperation. So the new Global Combat Air Programme, which we may talk about later on. But at the same time, I think we do need to be realistic as well. And I think this is maybe Tony's question that he raised. I think the UK and Japan are strongly aligned, but I still think there's a sense that Japan would like the UK to do more in its region than Japan is prepared to do in perhaps the UK's more immediate security region. So there's a lot of work to do there to make that relationship really sustainable.
Great, thank you. It's interesting reflecting on the desire by Japan to attract European countries to support it in its initiatives. Britain is not the only player in the Indo-Pacific. Guy Borg, as a French citizen, you'll be very well aware of everything that your government has been doing in terms of formulating its Indo-Pacific strategy. And maybe it's helpful to think comparatively about the nature of that bilateral relationship and how it compares to the Anglo-Japanese relationship. Not only in terms of understanding the dynamics that are bringing European countries to the Indo-Pacific, but also perhaps in thinking, what can Britain and France do together, given this common interest in regional security issues and the long relationship they both have with Japan?
Yes, the French are not exactly being drawn to the Indo-Pacific, or at least it's not something recent. Because they are in the Indo-Pacific, they have been for a long time, and they're. If you compare the presence, the UK presence, and the French presence in the Indo-Pacific, the French one's actually much more substantial. The UK has got about 1,500 military personnel in the Indo-Pacific and 2 patrol vessels in the South Pacific, where the French have got about 4,000 soldiers around the military personnel around the Indo-Pacific, all together scattered over the region. I mean, in the region, it's about 7,000 to 8,000 military personnel for about 2 million citizens, plus, not just frigates, so patrol vessels as well, but also things such as combat airplane fighters. So the Rafales, we have 6 Rafales in the Indo-Pacific, 4 Mirage 2000, 2,000, 2 Falcons, that's for maritime surveillance. South Pacific is basically much more for about maritime surveillance, the French presence is. And if you look at the what they have over there. In terms of the military presence, I mean, certainly the French one is quite overwhelming by comparison with the UK one. And nonetheless, if you look at the ties with allies, the UK has been much more aligned, and Japan's been much more closely establishing much closer relations with the UK, with Australia, with the US, and indeed really aligning its foreign policy on the or bringing it closer and closer with the UK's, Australia's, and US since the signature of AUKUS, whereas the French have rather managed to alienate their partners in the region. That's unfortunate. So we've seen really Japan get closer and closer in terms of defense industrial cooperation with the UK. We've talked about the combat aircraft. There's also with Australia, it is starting now. And of course, Japan signed the RAA. You were talking about the UK one. There's one with Australia as well. So really Japan's ensured that cooperation, and now over emerging disruptive technologies as well, is really moving forward with those countries. Whereas the French, I mean, the reason why it's not happening with the French, in spite of the fact that defense cooperation with the French started at the same time as it did between Japan and the French, at the same time as it did between the UK and Japan. That's in 2011, when the Democrat administration was in power in Japan. There was talk then of industrial cooperation with France as well, but that never picked up. And I think the reason is that precisely French diplomacy is not as well aligned on its partners. And we've seen that very strongly with President Macron in particular over his during his April visit to China. The signaling was completely wrong for Japan. And if you look at the wording of the joint communique that was released at the time, it's interesting to see that it sort of feels like what the Japanese call jidai okure. It's not in line with the current times, really. The wording is very similar to what the EU China joint communities used to be, how they used to be worded in 2019. So that's before the pandemic and before relations with China hardened. So France talked about cooperation with China. President Macron was very happy to have sold 160 Airbuses to China. And so, cooperation in such areas as aviation, airspace, civilian nuclear energy, and then also things that are such as deepening exchanges over strategic issues, in particular the dialogue between the PLA's South Theatre and the French Indo Pacific South Asia Pacific Command. So, to think that France is actually talking about, I mean, even though Japan and the US might engage, talk about defense issues, I mean, the idea of strengthening dialogue over China is not exactly what Japan expects from its partners. President Macron did not emphasize the importance of the status quo over Taiwan. He merely re-emphasized that France was attached to the one China policy. So really, if you compare President Macron's declarations over this during this China visit, and the ensuing interview which he gave on the return plane, which was, again, very, very bad signaling in terms of regarding Taiwan. And what Ursula von der Leyen said, whom he'd taken along, and in her press statement, she very clearly says that the relationship with China, she describes it as a complex relationship. She talks about de-risking through diplomacy. So the discourse is really very, very different. The phraseology, the wording is very different. Nevertheless, there is hope for cooperation, greater cooperation, both between France and Japan, and between the UK and France in the South Pacific. And indeed, your House of Commons Defence Committee released a report recently on the UK's defence in the Indo Pacific. And even though it doesn't list France in the defence relationships, in the UK's defence relationships in the Indo Pacific, it does call for increased cooperation with the US and France. So this, I think, is good. It also, when you look at military exercises, the French and the UK are side by side in the biggest ones. The La Pérouse one in March 2023, the Tasman Sabre one in August 2023. So militarily, I mean, the UK and France are already coordinating. The Charles de Gaulle, the French aircraft carrier, will be deployed in the region in 2024, and the Queen Elizabeth carrier strike group will be deployed the following year. So the coordination is really already happening. Nevertheless, I think the French signalling has not been favourable to great increased cooperation with Japan, and I think for cooperation to go further, you'd need that signalling to change, that messaging to change. So, the UK is willing to cooperate further; it's showing it, and I think France needs to adjust its diplomacy as well.
Okay, thank you for that. I mean, I would like to go to the audience very shortly because we're almost about halfway over. But before we do that, just a few short questions. First of all, to Yuichi-san, we've seen a much more explicit effort to think about strategy at the highest levels of government, going back to 2013 in the Abe administration. But all of this is happening at a time where, for Japan, the economic pressures seem to be very substantial. Prime Minister Kishida is suffering a big drop in his popularity as a result of his perceived failure to address some of the key economic issues for the Japanese electorate. How does that complicate the process of matching ends and means, do you think, in your assessment?
Right. Two things. Number one, largely because of the differences in their... Thank you very much. Two things, 2 points. Number one, largely because of the differences in their geopolitical, geographical locations. Naturally, each country has different strategic priorities. And due largely to its close geographical location, Japan has a very close link with China. We cannot abandon Chinese market and our close economic relationship with China. But at the same time, we need to maintain strong solidarity among like-minded partners. So Kishida and also Nakasone, two prime ministers, had a very special mission to try to bridge the two regions, Europe and Asia. Nakasone played a very important role, particularly in Williamsburg Summit in the United States, in persuading other Western leaders on the necessity of maintaining solidarity by avoiding decoupling among them. And I think that Prime Minister Nakasone was very successful. It's interesting to know that he did it in French, in persuading President François Mitterrand, on the necessity of being close to the United States. So Kishida did likewise to persuade Japanese audience as well as other Asian audience people on the necessity of supporting Ukraine, even though Ukraine is far away from Asia. So many Asian countries naturally thought that Ukrainian war in Ukraine is their war, European war, not our war. That's why we should maintain very close economic, political relationship with Russia. But this shouldn't be the case because it was an illegal war to undermine seriously the rule-based international order. This is what Kishida said. So because of this, I think that regardless of Japan's close economic relationship with China, because of the necessity of Japan to create a peace treaty with Russia, but however, I think that the Japan and Prime Minister Kishida has playing a very important role in trying to create a solidarity among the like-minded partner. But number two, at the same time, Japanese strategies is quite interesting in focusing on the importance of inclusiveness. Like Prime Minister Abe as well, and Prime Minister Kishida as well. Let me show you one interesting picture of the G20 summit in Osaka. You can see the face of Xi, President Xi of China, President Trump of the United States, and the European Commission President Juncker and Shinzo Abe at the center. I think only Prime Minister Abe could do this. Together, Trump, Xi, Juncker, and also Putin aside. Everybody was there. This was just 4 years before. After that, after the death of Shinzo Abe, we have been seeing the division, much more divisive international society, international community. Of course, this is not just because of the death of Shinzo Abe, but the Japanese strategy, including Prime Minister Kishida. Japanese strategy has been basically trying to strengthen the element of inclusiveness in international community. This is a slightly different strategy from American strategy, which has been focusing on much more confrontational aspect or decoupling aspect of strategies towards China. So I think that the Japan's strategy based on this inclusiveness and also resulting in the free and open Indo-Pacific is important, I think, because of this.
And that leads me to my last question before I turn it over to the floor, to Michito-san, which is the question of values, right? Because Yuichi, you're kind of describing a leadership that's inherently pragmatic and trying to bridge the division between authoritarian and democratic regimes. A criticism that has sometimes been made in some quarters about Japanese diplomacy is that it doesn't make hard choices about some of the values that are part of the rhetorical debate over foreign policy, promoting democracy, protecting freedom, that its interests have been over the Cold War period, being all things to all people, practicing omnidirectional diplomacy. Is that a fair criticism? Is it changing? Is there increasing space within public opinion as well as elite opinion for thinking about the values debate? How important is that, do you think, at the moment?
Yes, the Prime Minister Abe and some others have been emphasizing the value aspect of foreign policy. So value-based diplomacy is something that we have been talking about in Japan. But it's still quite true that as Yuichi said, that Japan's approach may be very different from that of the United States, but also at the same time, they may be, in some respects, different from various European countries. One of the reasons for that is the regional reality in the Asia Pacific region or in the Pacific region, where, for example, if you look at the ASEAN countries, the Southeast Asian countries, there are very few real liberal democracies. So this is just a reality. So we have to live with the reality. So yes, the strengthening relations with those who share values, yes, that's good. But at the same time, we need to address those who don't share values with you. So that's one of the reasons. And also still it's quite true, the awareness about the importance of promoting human rights, it's still somewhat very low in Japan, but more and more people are supportive of the idea of, for example, the important sanctions over human rights issues, Magnitsky Act type of things, and the discussions have been there. So the reality is there. So some of you can say that it's a pragmatic approach. Yes, it's very pragmatic, but at the same time, the Japan as a G7 member, sometimes that Japan has been sort of using G7 as a sort of a good excuse to strengthen rhetoric on human rights violations in various other countries, including Russia or China. So in that sense, the fact that this year that Japan is holding G7 presidency has been quite something, and also you can see G7 as a sort of a peacemaker for Japan's foreign policy, particularly regarding the human rights and value issues.
Okay, thank you very much. Well, that's a lot of food for thought. So let me take questions. When you ask your question, can you identify who you are? And if you have a specific person on the panel you want to direct your remarks to, please indicate. And there is a roving mic, I think, which will, if you can wait for the mic. So we'll start over here with Brendan.
Thank you very much. I'm Brendan Sims, co-director of the Centre. Really interesting panel. Thank you very much. My question concerns the issue that was raised briefly, which was whether there might be some kind of Japanese contribution to the security in Europe. And I'm reminded, of course, of the fact that in the First World War, after the German colonies had been sorted out, Japanese did actually send a flotilla to Malta, where it was based. And what I was wondering was if, for the sake of argument, there is an outbreak of peace and understanding between President Biden and Mr. Xi, which seems not impossible in the light of recent events, could our Japanese friends envisage a situation where Japanese forces, not being required in East Asia immediately, were sent in the direction of Europe?
Can we start with Anthony, because you... Oh, and can we just pass the mic as well? So.
It is worth noting during the First World War, the British also wanted capital ships for the North Sea and were turned down. I'm not an expert on contemporary affairs. I'm not an expert on contemporary strategy. But as far as I can see, the one thing we need to remember about talking about military powers doing anything useful overseas is the ability to project power. And that means a heavy lift capability. So are you really going to say to the Americans, could you help the Japanese to have a flotilla in the Mediterranean? And if I were in the White House, I would want the British in the Atlantic. I'd want the Australians, Indians if possible, and America in the Pacific. Why would you want a sharing of forces in different areas? I even hearing about aircraft carriers from Europe going to the Indo Pacific, I just think, to me, it just doesn't make any sense. But I can understand there may be reasons for it, flying the flag, but in terms of the security problems we have now, I really think we're beyond symbolism, aren't we? We really do need to consider carefully what forces ought to be in what region, because we're dealing with an aggressive Russia. We're dealing with potentially an aggressive PRC. I think we're beyond symbolism.
Anyone else on the panel who shares Anthony's scepticism? Well, we might be surprised. Chris?
No, I share Anthony's scepticism. I mean, I think Japan, it is doing things to assist, in the European theatre, the UK and so on. So, it is thinking about, trying to work more closely with NATO, trying to think. I think a very interesting thing would be to watch, talking of logistics and so on, is whether, Japan has a very strong demand for munitions, and whether, there may be some kind of attempt to sort of pool production around munitions in the future. In terms of Ukraine, I mean, obviously Japan is providing non-lethal military assistance, a lot of important economic assistance. There has been discussion, maybe others will have more detail. There has been discussion about providing lethal aid, but I think that's really off the agenda. I think Japan sees its role, and I think probably the US expectation, and probably actually Japan's best role, is really to anchor its own region, and to make sure that it's strong in terms of its own defence, supports the United States presence, and obviously contains any kind of adventurism by China or by Russia in its own region. But others might have another opinion.
Yeah. Paul wants to come in and then...
Just a couple of quick points. Our Japanese colleagues will be able to talk much better than I can about Japanese reluctance to operate out of area. But the 2 points I was going to make is, one, it's impossible to overestimate the influence of the US approach in terms of Japanese consideration, you know, at least since you've got 50,000 American military and materiel in Japan. So a lot of Japan's thinking will be influenced by what America wants. And I think one of the reasons why the UK and Japan defence relationship has progressed is because America has encouraged it. I mean, it's inconceivable that we would have entered onto a massive new project to build new combat aircraft together if the Americans were reluctant to for that to happen, if they'd had a Lockheed Martin aircraft that they wanted to sell into that space. And the second issue is, of course, in terms of security nowadays, it's not just about traditional military security. There's a much bigger focus on economic security now, as we saw coming out of the G7. And so Japan's contribution to European security in future may be more around things like its willingness to join in sanctions, as it has on Russia, and its ability to cooperate on new partnerships on chips and on critical mineral supply and that sort of thing.
Okay. Yes, of course.
Thank you very much. Okay. Maybe Japanese speaker can say a word on this question. Of course, I largely agree with some of the things which are already mentioned, and I agree with very strong, reluctant, perhaps, attitudes of Japanese ordinary people to respond positively to the request coming from the United States or European countries. But at the same time, we need to answer to this question in a different way. Number one, the war becomes much more digitalized, and interoperability is important. There are not so many American allies who can fully respond to this request. I mean, interoperability and network-centric warfare. Of course, UK can do it, and to some extent, of course, Australia and Canada can do it. But at the same time, there are not so many countries in the world, number one, who can share important value. Number two, who can do operation with the United States in a higher level. So in the sense, Japan can be a good candidate for that, regardless of the very strong possible reluctant opinion coming from Japan. And there are two interesting cases. I mean, Afghanistan a century ago and Afghanistan 2 decades ago. A century ago, of course, Anthony knows it very well, the UK government requested Japan to defend in Afghanistan. But of course, it was difficult for Japanese Imperial Army to respond to this positively. 2 decades ago, after the outbreak of the war in Afghanistan, again, the United States government asked Japanese government to send some of the helicopters, strategic transportation, because there are so many countries who actually obtain important helicopters for strategic transportation. That's why U.S. government, NATO, want Japan to do something. But of course, Japan responded negatively to this request. The reason why they asked Japan to do this is because of defense capabilities. And like Aegis ships as well, Japan was the only American ally who had, now there are many countries, but previously, who had Aegis ships in its own navy. So in the sense, it's natural for the United States to ask Japan to do more in this sense. But as I said, the reluctance of Japanese people is overwhelming. So I don't think that it is probable. But at the same time, now we also need to think about cyberspace and otherwise. And there are many things that Japan can do, like cyber security in Asia. Japanese government has some advantage in obtaining information in Asia, particularly in regard to the cyberspace. So it's natural that the NATO like to have Japanese cooperation in the name of AP4, together with Australia, New Zealand, and also South Korea. Not because they requested the Japanese dispatching of forces to European theater, but largely because of the help coming from Japan in this realm of cyberspace. So I think that there are something that Japan can offer to Europe in strengthening European security, but in a quite indirect, different ways.
I'll just briefly basically in Europe we do have NATO, and that works fairly well, and everybody's interoperational. So, and for the self-defense forces to be deployed, there are strict requirements for the moment. So they can be deployed for a number of, there are there's a legal framework. Well, there are a number actually still. So for a peacekeeping operation, or for if there is an international crisis that bears an important influence on Japan's peace and security. And in that case, Japan would be able to provide ammunitions, but not weapons. Or if Japan's survival is at stake, in which case it can actually use force even for the benefit of its allies. But that's a very marginal situation. So just to deploy would depend on the kind of situation we were considering. If it's peacekeeping, like we've seen, and it can't be peacemaking yet, so it could be a situation like we've seen in Iraq, or where the situation's relatively pacified. And if it turns a bit nasty, then as we saw in South Sudan, then the self-defense forces would be taken out of the country. So it's still very restrictive. So even though Japan's been attempting to show that it was doing as much as it could to help Ukraine, A, it's not doing very much really, and B, it doesn't mean that it's able to provide any more in a different kind of situation. So limited still.
Okay, thank you. Question here.
So, thank you very much. Mark Logan, Member of Parliament for Bolton North East and Vice Chair on the All-Party Parliamentary Group for Japan. What would a Trump administration mean for UK-Japan relations in particular? And also, I think a lot of times the underlying assumption is, and this, I'm speaking as someone who's a sinologist by background, is that the Japan-China relationship cannot get better. It will only get worse. Is that definitely the destiny, or is there an opportunity for the two countries to actually have a more harmonious relationship? And I think both countries really like the kanji of harmony. And then lastly, a practical one for Paul. It's just around within Parliament, because there's a very low understanding of Japan, and not a massive interest in furthering the relationship, not because of any animosity, but just because of business a lot of time. What ideas would you have for parliamentarians to actually maybe follow in the United States example of improving those bilateral relations? Thank you.
So 3 questions for us to consider. Who would like to kick off? Yeah. Giborg? Yeah.
Well, Japan-China, I would say, you need China to change a bit before Japan-Chinese relations can improve, because they used to be good. I mean, they were fine until the 1990s, when history issues emerged. But even then, China had such a strong interest in seeing trade improve and still getting development aid from Japan, that history issues were only of marginal impact. It's really since 2013 and Xi Jinping that ideologies become such an important driver for the regime, and also that we've seen China rise in such a way, and now it has risen. Now it is a major power that we have to deal with, which is why everybody gets organised around it. That's why, hence AUKUS and the UK-Japan cooperation we've been talking about, and so on. But provided. What anybody would wish, I think, any government would wish for China to be willing to abide by the international rules that have really benefited it and ensured its rise, and just to ensure that freedom of the high seas was possible, for instance, that there was no threat to international navigation and communications. Because that's what we're concerned about. That's why there's this interest for the Indo Pacific, and that's why France and the UK want to show that they are present over there and exercising some deterrent. I think the China probably doesn't see it that way, and I'm a Japan specialist, so you might have a different view, being you may be more sympathetic to China than I am, but that would be my answer.
Chris, are you going to predict the future and anticipate what happens if Trump wins?
Yeah, I was going to do Trump 2.0. I think just like probably just like most of the international community, I think Japan would be again quite anxious about the return of a Trump administration, because that would bring what we saw. In all likelihood, it would bring the same kind of transactional approach to the management of alliances, which was, I think Japan and Abe coped with it quite well first time round, but it's certainly very uncomfortable. And this time around, it may actually be perhaps, Trump might be more organised as an administration, so therefore might actually be able to pursue that agenda in a slightly more concerted, systematic way. So I think Japanese policymakers would be nervous. What does it mean for the UK-Japan relationship? I mean, I think it would probably, certainly bolster that relationship. I think, Japan sees Japan as a UK as a good partner. Its national security strategy, national defence strategy, it does talk about trying to diversify its security relationships. It's not using language of hedging, but I mean I think it gives Japan a little bit more some options, and particularly around defence industrial cooperation again, with the fighter program and so on. So although I think that program will come under a lot of pressure potentially if you did have another Trump administration, I still think there's even though as Paul said, maybe the US had nothing to sell particularly that the Japanese wanted, or they wanted it on the terms when they decided to go for GCAP. Nevertheless, I think the Americans are hoping that the project's going to fail, and the Japanese will come back to them. So Trump is waiting in the wings. But I think still Japan's primary impulse, as we saw that under Abe administration, is to strengthen that relationship with the United States and to become a closer ally, more indispensable ally, more integrated ally, because they believe that actually perhaps that gives more leverage or something more to bring to the party in dealing with the United States. So yes, the UK-Japan relationship will remain strong, I think, and Japan will continue to invest in it. It will be under pressure, but I think Japan will still pour the vast amount of its energy into keeping that US-Japan alliance relationship strong.
Let's hear from our Japanese colleagues.
Actually, I agree to Chris about the point about whoever sits in the White House. The US is the US, and the US is the only ally for Japan, which is prepared to help defend Japan. So yes, the prospect of Trump's coming back to power, yes, that worries a lot, but still, we will have to live with that. So that's my point. And also regarding China, it used to be that we are talking about improving relations with China, but these days what we say is that we need to manage relations and we need to stabilize our relations with China. So that tells you something about the sort of the declining sort of a level of ambition. So that's I think is a very important shift. Thank you.
Yuichi, do you want to add to this, or are you happy with what we've just heard?
I agree with that.
Okay. Let's go back to, Paul, did you have something to add from a diplomatic perspective on the US-Japan relationship?
Just briefly on the US, I was in Washington about 3 weeks ago, and I saw Bill Hagerty, who was my opposite number as the American ambassador at the time I was there. He's now a Republican senator. But generally talking to people across the board in Washington, I think my biggest impression was a hardening of attitudes towards China across the spectrum. And I guess US-Japan relations will be a beneficiary of that. And Kishta's going to have to play a lot of golf if it's Donald Trump. On MPs, well, I think it's impressive that in this room tonight we have a member of the House of Commons, and we also have a member of the House of Lords at the back. And I would very much commend the work of the UK-Japan 21st Century Group, which Andrew Lansley chairs, which brings together every year a group of politicians, people from business, people from academia, and it's probably the most important civil society dialogue between the two countries, and it has enabled over the years a number of British parliamentarians to get to know their Japanese opposite numbers. So I think those sorts of things are really good initiatives.
Anthony, did you want to comment on the soft power dimension? Because I think the question was directed at you, but if you don't, we can move on.
Soft power. Well, you mentioned in the correspondence we had before that obviously it would be good if there were stronger links. I have to say at the LSE, Japanese students are few and far between. And if anything, it's gone down. The numbers of Chinese students goes up and up and up. I hope that Japanese students are still going to the US in sizable numbers, but they're certainly not coming to us. And I think that is worrying. I think obviously the language issue is very important. I don't know of any solution to it, apart from I'm happy to take on decent PhD students. But one of the things is, we have to have faith that the IELTS scores mean that we're not going to have to correct every single paragraph. And so, you may get somebody applying and you think, well, this is really just too much work. So yes, I think there are definite problems there, but it's more on no, it is on both sides, obviously, but I don't see an easy solution to it.
Okay. There's a question in the front here. Can you wait for the mic, please? Thanks.
Richard Dearlove. I'm the former master of Pembroke College and the former chief of MI6. And it's really a question for our Japanese colleagues, but maybe others would like to answer it more broadly. And I have to emphasize that my intimate knowledge of the bilateral relationship is about 20 years out of date. But I'd like to pick up on two phrases which our Japanese colleagues have used: Japanese reluctance and inclusiveness. And I'm considering those two terms in relation to Japan's lack of a cohesive and identifiable intelligence community, because it's very dispersed and bitty and has not been unified. And in my own experience dealing with Japan, there was, let's say, a significant risk-averse element in their attitude to intelligence collection. And what we felt in the West generally, and I think this applies in the United States, that Japan had many natural advantages, particularly in relation to China and very much so to North Korea, in making a much bigger contribution to the West's intelligence community. And there was a very strong reluctance to exploit those opportunities. And I was pretty frequently in Tokyo talking to my Japanese colleagues, who of course listened to me very politely, but didn't actually do very much in response. And it was particularly frustrating in relation to North Korea, given the size of the North Korean community in Japan. And I found at the time that we were actually much better informed on these issues than Japan was. Now, as Japan's policies have changed, as its defense policies have changed, as it's become more assertive in its own foreign policy, is there a possibility that this issue will change? Because I think it's a very important part of a broader defense and security relationship. Sorry, it's rather a long question, but I think you've clearly got the point.
Yeah. Well, thank you for your brilliant question. A decade ago, I wrote a book in Japanese language on Tony Blair's foreign policy, and your name appeared several times. In which, well, actually, I admire. No. I really admire a very strong tradition of intelligence service in the UK, of course, for centuries. And we have to, Japan should learn many things from British experience, both success and failures as well. And before 1945, we had much stronger intelligence service. But after the end of the war, GHQ and the Japanese government actually destroyed large part of the pre-war Japanese intelligence system. And largely because of the strong pacifist tradition after 1945, we tend to think in Japan that the democracy should have much more diversified, a much more decentralized power. I don't think it is true or not. But basically, partly because of this, interdepartmental rivalry is very strong, as you know. In Japan, particularly in its relation to intelligence, it's very strong. But at the same time, I also like to say that there are two aspects of Japanese intelligence. Number one, police service, the domestic intelligence is very strong in Japan. Number two, foreign intelligence services is really weak. And the Japanese cabinet secretariat has been basically occupied by free war home office departments. So it means that the police agency has been really strong in controlling Japanese intelligence system. On the other hand, MOFA, Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and Japanese MOD have had very limited power at the center of Japanese political system. So we, as you imply a bit, we have some strength in gathering information in relation to China and North Korea, but particularly Chinese and North Korean activity within Japan. But at the same time, largely because of our language specialties, like during the war in during the war in Afghanistan, there are many Japanese people who are living in Afghanistan, and the Japanese government has been gathering information and providing this to the US government. Because it's interesting to know that in a Japanese university, Tokyo University of Foreign Studies, there is a course for Pashtun language. So every year, some students learn Afghanistan Pashtun language. But in the United States, it's difficult to find those Americans who actually study Pashtun language. So, well, this is one case. So in Japan, we have a very good tradition of educating those students who are very strong in area studies and foreign languages. This is not the case currently in the United States. So we are partly good at gathering information from those people who are living all over the world. But the Japanese government is not good at collecting those relevant intelligence information, both particularly from a civilian sector. So the private-public partnership is one thing. We need to strengthen it. And also the lack of strong foreign intelligence service is another thing. But by overcoming some of these shortcomings, maybe we can provide something to our allies and partners in the area that the UK and the US do not have sufficient information about that. Maybe, yeah.
Oh yes, great points, and I love that. And just a few things to add. And first is that it's really encouraging to hear such a very good expectations about Japan's potential to do more and to help the UK and others. And also that is exactly why that because of Japan's seeming strengths when it comes to China and North Korea, that Five Eyes countries are sort of having the bigger expectations about Japan and getting closer to Japan, which is really encouraging. But there are some problems on the Japanese side, one of which, of course, is the information security issues. So lack of counter-espionage legislation and other things, and that makes a bit difficult for other countries to share intelligence information with Japan, and so that is one thing. And another thing is that you're quite right that you talked about the risk-averse attitude in Japan. I fully agree to that. I see that the way in which Japan assesses intelligence and information is very much looks like we are seeking to achieve the level of certainty that is required for criminal justice investigation. But foreign intelligence business is really different from that. But because of a police dominance in Japan's intelligence thinking and intelligence organizations, that we tend to seek to achieve criminal justice level of certainty. So we need to change mindset, and we need to learn how foreign intelligence business works. So in that sense, we are trying to learn more from the UK, US, and France, and others. Thank you.
We have time, I'm afraid, for probably just one more question, regrettably. And I know that Professor Adelson had his hand up. Do you want to take that?
Thank you. So I'm Miki Adolfsson. I'm the chair of Japanese studies. I'm a medievalist. I know nothing about contemporary politics. Anything after 1600 is not relevant in my world. But having said that, what strikes me as being so interesting is the role that the US is playing in the security in the Pacific. And I mean, our Japanese colleagues are like, they're really hoping that this will continue and it will be strong. So let us imagine, if you will, that election in the US goes towards Trump. Let us imagine that he decides that this is a waste of money and that he starts pulling troops back and Okinawa finally becomes free of US troops. Let us imagine that for a second. So my question is, what is the blueprint for security in the Pacific if that happens? Are there plans? How would you secure the Indo Pacific in that situation? And if that happens, does Europe play a role in that? I very much take your points that is Europe going to send or set up some kind of base over there if US is not there? So I wonder what the blueprint is if that situation happens.
A nice, easy question to answer in about 30 seconds each. Can we pass the mic down to you, Anthony? Yeah.
The one thing that I'm surprised at so far is no one has said South Korea in all of this. And to me, as an outsider, I know all of the historical problems. The most important thing that can happen in the future, as far as I'm concerned, is that Japan and South Korea become closer. And anything that the UK can do to help that relationship would be advantageous. I think, in fact, considering the world at large, asking South Korea to join the G7 would be a really sensible thing to do. I was talking to it with a very enthusiastic Korean student yesterday who wants to go on to work for the diplomatic service, and I gave him a job to do, try and negotiate that.
Okay, should we just go down the line and anyone who wants to contribute? Paul?
I think the US is probably the indispensable power for Indo-Pacific security, and I think without their presence there, I think Japan would struggle to know what its strategy should be, and I think others from outside the region would be very reluctant to be engaged.
I tend to agree. There may be potentially, you might fill the gap if the US was to kind of withdraw, take its legions home, as it were, but I think it's, without the US as that sort of intervening, mediating power, I think it's quite hard. I mean, there is cooperation, emerging between, ROK, Japan and US, and that's got some mileage in it, but without the US, sort of pushing it along, I think it may struggle. Australia could do more, India could do more, and so on. It hasn't been mentioned yet. Again, I think it's a terrible scenario for the Japanese, but I think, if Japan really has to then fend for its own security, then I think we are talking about, Japan has to think about its nuclear option again.
Yes, Donald Trump did invest more in the South Pacific, and he also drew attention on problems with China. So, he was the first to do that. So, having said that, he did hint that he might withdraw troops, and he did suggest that Japan should go nuclear, and South Korea as well, to boot. So, but then provided that, the decision is for the US to withdraw and it's taking out its troops, well, I think indeed, we'd have maybe Australia, maybe France, who has 5 commands in the Indo Pacific again. And South Korea and, everybody. And that's what, Japan in a way has been preparing for, not for the US to withdraw entirely, but has been preparing for alternatives. It's not exactly alternatives, but and not backup plans exactly. It's always on top of the US and as well as the US. But certainly all the defense relationships that Japan's been developing because the US alone is not enough, and Japan knows it. So.
Right. Japan attacked and invaded China several times, but there was only once that China invaded Japan. It was 800 years ago. Well, much. Exactly. The combination of Chinese and Mongolians. Okay, and so that's why we have been. I mean, Japan has had 100 years history of making a stable relationship, trying to have a stable relationship with China or Mongol or anything. And we have been successful in many ways. And in 1274, when Mongol invaded Japan, we didn't have an alliance relationship with the United States. So we can learn our experience of that.
In the foreseeable future, the U.S. role can't be substituted by others. But of course, at the same time, the Japan needs to strengthen its defense and deterrence posture, including by increasing defense budget. That's a sort of a requirement. But in addition to that, there are two things that Japan will need to do. And first is to remind Americans that it's America's own interest to remain engaged in the region. So it's not for the sake of Japan, it's not for the sake of South Korea. No, it's in America's own interest to remain in the region. So reminding that repeatedly is something that we will have to do. And the other thing is to reach out to Congress, including House and Senate. Because the president is one thing, but at the same time, the important, crucial actor is Congress. So reaching out to individual members of House and individual senators, that the importance of that is going to increase. Thank you.
We are unfortunately out of time, but I think, Yuichi-san, your response to Professor Adolfson's question is a timely reminder that the history of this relationship and the history of international relations in East Asia still is essentially important in thinking about contemporary problems. That's a nice way, I think, of illustrating what Brendan has been pushing for in establishing the Centre for Geopolitics, the relationship between a historical perspective and what we've been talking about today. Maybe that will go some way, Anthony, to, despite the fact that you were perhaps in the minority in the panel when it comes to regional engagement on the part of Japan in Europe, demonstrate the importance of that historical perspective. All that remains is to thank our panel and to invite all of you in the audience to join us for drinks. You can see there are glasses primed and ready, and alcohol will be forthcoming. And again, to thank the audience for its questions, to thank our sponsors, and most importantly of all, to thank our panelists for their responses.